This video is on clauses and conjunctions. Now, clauses and conjunctions are two major elements, obviously, of Greek, but what it's also going to involve is us having to go back and look at English grammar to understand that. This is probably one of the most crucial videos for understanding exegesis, for using Greek for exegesis. So clauses as a basic building block, clauses as basic building blocks are incredibly important for exegeting Greek. So this means you have to understand main clauses, you have to understand subordinate clauses, how they're subordinate and how they relate to main clauses, phrases, etc. All of those things and how they relate are the basic elements of understanding the logical flow of a passage. If you don't understand that, then you can't understand the basic logic of a passage. Conjunctions as well will give our kind of like if they were math symbols or something. They show you continuation, they show you purpose, they show you result, they show you contrast, all of those things that are being signaled by the author in the argument that they're making. So to get these down will be crucial for you to get down the importance of Greek for exegesis. Now, there will be a handout on clauses and conjunctions, and most of the stuff that is in there is taken from Wallace's grammar. There are some, these can be building blocks for you talking about logical relationships within texts, structural relationships, and as I said already a couple times, these are crucial for you to be able to understand the logic and the movement of the passage. And so what we're going to do now is we're going to look at what is on that handout that I gave you on clauses and conjunctions. Now you will note on this sheet that it says LG 512C, at least in the video it says that. Don't worry about that. This is obviously, that's just one class that this was made for. Your class has a different title. So let's look at that sheet. And we'll start looking at that sheet with clauses and what sorts of different clauses there are. We know right away we have to make the distinction between independent clauses and dependent clauses, or main clauses and subordinate clauses. An independent clause is normally just a subject and predicate, or at least a subject and predicate. In Greek, these clauses are often introduced by conjunctions or prepositional phrases in order to situate them in context. But the independent clause is that which stands by itself. It's a clause that can be independent, is not dependent on other clauses. Those conjunctions will that are put at the beginning of clauses will relate it to another clause, will show how that independent clause relates to another one. But at the same time, it is not those are not that does not make it a dependent clause necessarily. Prepositional phrases often, when situating it, will be adverbial and related to the main verb of the independent clause. But the important point here is that independent clauses stand alone. Then, of course, the other one is dependent clauses. These are in a subordinate relationship or substantival adjectival relationship. That is, these dependent clauses can function as substantives, as we've talked about with, for instance, the substantive infinitive. Or adjectival, they can modify other adjectives. But they're not independent clauses in themselves. They do not stand alone as clauses. And so that's an important distinction that we need to make. Independent clauses versus dependent clauses, or main sentences versus subordinate sentences, stuff like that. Also, a simple sentence is just a simple independent clause. A compound sentence is a conjunction of two or more independent clauses, and a compound sentence is different than a complex sentence. A simple sentence is just a simple independent clause. A complex sentence is a sentence in which one or more clauses is subordinated and dependent on a independent clause. So the complex sentence is a simple sentence to which a whole bunch of dependent clauses, or at least another dependent clause, is added. This is different than a compound sentence because a compound sentence is between two or more independent clauses, where a complex sentence is a sentence that is an independent clause with additional subordinate and dependent clauses. Now, there can be, of course, complex compound sentences, but that's not our concern right now. So in terms of dependent clauses are structurally defined. So these are not independent clauses. These are not clauses that stand by themselves, but they are clauses that have a specific relationship to the independent clause. They can be infinitival, they can be participial, they can be conjunctive, that is introduced by a subordinating conjunction. So if they're dependent clauses, it will have to be a subordinating conjunction. And they can be relative clauses. Syntactically, sometimes they can be substantival, that is, they function like a noun. So sometimes dependent clauses can fit into the subject slot or the object slot, and stuff like that. And we'll talk, and we've talked about how that can function with certain forms like participles, and we've talked about how it can function with certain forms like infinitives. But we'll talk a little bit more about other subordinating conjunctions that make that possible as well. They can also be adjectival, that is, they function like an adjective. They describe, explain, or restrict a noun, pronoun, or other substantive. When they can be adverbial, that is, they can modify the verbal action of the verb and of the independent clause. And a lot of times that's what's going on. You have adverbial subordinate clauses. Some important things to think about are the relationship between the subordinate clause and that adverbial construction. So how does the subordinate clause, if it is adverbial, if it is an adverbial dependent clause, relate to the verb? And here is 11 different ways that is possible. This is just a good reference point. So it's just a whole lot of information that's thrown at you, but it gives you an idea about how to discuss the relationship between dependent clauses or subordinate clauses to main clauses. This can even go sometimes for talking about prepositional phrases, relative clauses, participial phrases, especially participial phrases, because you'll notice that some of these are ones that are defined as participial uses, right? So cause, concession, condition, those sorts of things. So let's look at each one of these. A cause, an adverbial dependent clause, is one that indicates the cause. Really, the key words here are because or on account of. It substantiates the action of the main verb. The example that I have here is Jesus sat because he was weary. Now, your main clause is, or your main sentence is, Jesus sat. That's the independent clause. But then we have this dependent clause, because he was weary. And that modifies the sat, right? So we can put little parentheses around here. And we know that it functions adverbially to indicate the cause of the sitting. Jesus sat can stand alone, but because he was weary, offers a modification of the verbal idea. So it explains why he sat, and that's what cause does. It gives the answer why something happens. So when you see that, and you can translate it as because. And there you know the logical relationship of what's happening there. Now, of course, we know some of these logical relationships intuitively, and we don't have to think about it. We're just assuming them. But in reality, when you're doing exegesis, even though you can assume them and you get the sense of what's going on, you want to be able to explain that in explicit terms. And so in order to explain that, you use this language, causal. You can also have subordinate clauses or dependent clauses that are comparison clauses. That the key words for this are as or like. And so here is an example. And be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. And then it answers, what manner are you supposed to do that in? How? As God in Christ has forgiven you. So in what manner are you supposed to be? Kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another. What is the standard for that? Well, it is God in Christ. That is your standard for care for one another. The next one, concession, although. It explains the action of the verb is true despite, and that's the important one, despite the dependent adverbial clause. Although they knew God, they did not honor him as God. Right? So what is our independent clause? Our independent clause that can stand alone is they did not honor him as God. And then we have a dependent clause. Although they knew God, right? They did not honor although they knew God. Right? So in spite of not knowing God, right? Or they honored him in spite of not knowing God. A condition is the opposite logical relationship of concession. This dependent adverbial clause will explain the condition under which the verb it is modifying is actualized. You will receive it, right? That is our independent clause. You will receive it. What is our dependent clause? If you believe. Now, if you believe cannot stand alone. You don't just say if you believe, but if you believe modifies this verbal idea. So the receiving depends on this condition, if you believe. Complementary clauses, these complete the idea of main verbs. We saw this specifically with infinitives. We saw how this was a big deal with infinitives. Your ancestor Abraham rejoiced. Right? So that's fine. That ends. That is a sentence in its own. That he would see my day is a clause that cannot stand on its own, but it modifies the rejoicing. How did he rejoice, or why did he rejoice? Or explaining the idea, the rejoicing, right? It's not any kind of rejoicing. The content of the rejoicing, or the reason and content for the rejoicing, is that he would see my day. So that is a complement to that main idea. Number 6, location. So a lot of times adverbial clauses will tell you where something happens. So it is locative. Other seed fell on rocky ground where it did not have much soil. So other seed fell on rocky ground, independent clause. And then it says something about it. Where it did not have much soil. So the location of the falling was where it did not have much soil. Manner, by, explains how the verb occurred, generally with an emotion or attitude. We talked about this with participial phrases. They went on their way is an independent clause, but then we have this participle rejoicing. It explains the manner of going. This is not needed. We could just say in a bare sentence, bare independent clause. They went on their way. But here, this idea of rejoicing modifies the verbal idea. Number 8, means. We can translate that as by or with. It carries a lot of times an instrumental notion, the physical or mental means by which the verb is accomplished. So our independent clause here, I sinned by betraying innocent blood. Our independent clause is I sinned. That stands by itself. By betraying innocent blood does not stand by itself, but it does modify sin. And this, of course, is another participial phrase, but that's the whole idea. I sinned, and then how did I sin? What was the means of sinning? By betraying innocent blood. Purpose can be translated as in order that. It explains the purpose of the action of the verb that it is modifying. For Christ also suffered for sins once for all in order to bring you to God. So for Christ suffered for sins once for all. That stands by itself. But then we get the purpose, in order to bring you to God. There's result. With the result that, so it explains the result of the action of the verb it is modifying without specifying what the action was done for the purpose of this result. So let's look at this example. So I ask, have they stumbled with the result of falling, with so as to fall? And here the idea is not they stumbled for the purpose of falling, but they stumbled and the result of that stumbling is falling. And then finally we have temporal phrases. Right? These are phrases, subsequent clauses that locate them within a specific moment in time. So in Matthew 19:1, when Jesus had finished saying these things, he left Galilee. Now he left Galilee as an independent clause, stands all by itself. But when did the leaving happen? Well, that's what we have the subordinate clause for. And so it modifies, it's adverbial, it modifies that idea. And as we have said before, this can be subsequent, contemporaneous, or antecedent time. So all of these adverbial dependent clauses, it's kind of a mishmash of all of the different relationships that we've learned so far with other verb forms and other forms of relations to adverbial relations. So it's just kind of a mishmash. But what I want you to be able to do is to think about this in terms of the broader logic of passages. When you go through and you exegete a passage, figure out how the clauses relate to each other. What are the dependent clauses? And when you have a dependent clause that is adverbial, for instance, specifically, what is the logic that relates that adverbial clause to the main verb? Sometimes it might just be stuff that you take for granted. Even then, it's good to practice it so you get the sense. But other times it might be it might be really significant to the logic. It might show you, once you start thinking about it more clearly, it might show you how the different elements relate to each other. So this is a more broader way of understanding structural relationships that are more apparent in the Greek. And it also gives you a way to tease out some ambiguous areas too. So there might be arguments about ways that you translate a participial phrase or subordinating conjunction or things like that. And it's important for you to be able to clarify that logic when you are doing exegesis. So if this is a Greek class that's built on understanding exegesis, then all that stuff is important. Understanding Greek for exegesis. The other side of that handout is not about clauses, but conjunctions. Now, conjunctions do a lot of the same stuff, right? So conjunctions often will be, so participles and infinitives and prepositions will often give you logical connecting ideas that connect clauses and phrases to independent clauses and help you to figure out the logic. Conjunctions will do a lot of that work as well. And sometimes you'll often see conjunctions that pull together two independent clauses or two independent sections that show you what is the logical movement from one section to the next. Now, when we read in English and when we read in Greek, we're moving from left to right. And so there are logical movements from that left to the right. Often it's causation, because as we move, one thing causes the next thing. But there are other relations that we have to understand in logic. This really specifically works in epistolary literature, where you're trying to understand the logic that relates Paul's arguments, for instance, all that sort of stuff. That's real important. So just like there are independent and dependent clauses, there are coordinating and subordinating conjunctions. And that's an important distinction for you to know to understand structural relationships. Coordinating conjunctions link two equal ideas together. Often they can link two independent clauses, but they can link two subjects, objects, or even paragraphs together that are not, one is not subordinated to the other. Subordinating conjunctions, however, link a dependent clause to an independent clause, right? They link a subordinate idea to an independent idea. So there is, with subordinating conjunctions, as you can see in the name subordinating, there is this hierarchical idea. If we look at these conjunctions that I have laid out right here, I have listed three different categories: logical conjunctions, adverbial conjunctions, and substantival conjunctions. Logical conjunctions connect ideas through a certain logical framework, right? So I have a whole bunch of stuff listed here, and I'd prefer it if you just looked at it and then maybe go through Wallace. There's a chapter in Wallace where he goes through and he talks about these. I've given you this more as a reference sheet so you can see the different conjunctions and how they are related to specific logical categories: assensive, even, connective, and contrastive, but, rather, however. Even within those categories, though, you need to know the nuances of the different words. So, for instance, contrastive, though both Allah and de are contrastive, Allah is a strong contrasting, and de is kind of a contrasting that maintains a connection. So it's a looser contrasting conjunction. So there's lots of different ways that you can understand these conjunctions, and all of these will give you a logical relationship. Understanding these conjunctions and how they're used, a lot of theology is in conjunctions. How do things relate to each other? And when they give you, when an author gives you explicit conjunctions, it's important to know how they're functioning. So it's up to you to figure that out in doing your exegesis. Often when I'm doing exegesis, I will break passages down into dependent clauses and independent clauses and circle conjunctions to understand what logical progressions are being made. So I'll try to understand conjunctions. I'll try to understand adverbial relations of subordinate clauses, things like that. All of that will give me insight into the argument that is being made or the narrative presentation that's being made. Adverbial conjunctions will do a lot of what we noted on the front. So we noted that there were all of these different sorts of adverbial clause relationships. So there will be subordinate adverbial clauses that relate to independent clauses or things like that. A lot of those clauses are created by using specific conjunctions. And so here under number 2, we have a lot of those adverbial clauses and the relationships. And I don't need to go over that. We talked about those relationships on the last page, and you have gone over these relationships in other places. But you should know that they are part of the basic structural logic of Greek passages. And then the third category is a smaller category, but it's what we call substantival conjunctions. Substantival conjunctions will do things like give you the content of a thought, so that's a substantive, or they will create a subject or an object, so that will be a substance in itself. They will explain, so they'll function exegetically to modify nouns. So that's how they work on substantives, right? And so they don't function adverbially or just structurally to create logical connection. They modify nouns, adjectives. They function as nouns and adjectives. So those are important to be aware of as well. As a matter of fact, the most important ones are haughty and hina. So you'll note that those two show up quite a bit, haughty and hina. Up to this point with haughty, I've given some lip service to different uses. Well, there really are 3 primary uses of haughty: substantival, exegetical, and causal. Now, really what you've been focused on translating is often it's either means because or that. However, there's a lot more logic that is needed for you to understand to really grasp what you're doing when you translate it as because or that. So the simple one, number 3 under haughty, causal, is that's what it is. Because, right? It gives you a causal clause. It's an adverbial causal clause. I did these things because, and it explains the doing. It gives the why. That's pretty straightforward. Then there's the exegetical and the substantive, and then those ones are both translated as that. Now we'll go over different ways that those appear, but a lot of times we've been talking about it in terms of marking direct discourse or mental perception. That is, it's creating a substantive. It is creating the substance of that thought. It is creating the substance of the speech by putting the haughty there. We'll have lots of examples for that. Hina, as we note, is most often used, though not totally used, with the subjunctive. In Koine Greek, it's continually more and more used with the subjunctive, though in classical Greek there was a lot more nuance, so that uses of the hina could do things like express certain moods with the indicative that you wouldn't get with the subjunctive. That's falling out of favor with Koine Greek because it's just too complex. Koine Greek is going through a real simplification because it's a language that has spread over a huge swath of the world and used by non-native speakers. And so a lot of the subtleties are going away, like the optative mood, as we talked about. So often we find it in the subjunctive, but in the New Testament we do find a few places where the indicative is used. Don't read too much into it, and think about it specifically in those contexts, what it means. So let's look at haughty and hina more closely. Haughty. So as we noted, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through one by one the haughty examples there and just give you some Greek examples to maybe make sense out of how to figure that out. So we begin with substantival uses of the hoti, and you'll notice that was our biggest category. The first substantival use of the hoti that we want to talk about is subject. Ektu ionos uk ekusthe. It was not heard from the ages, right? And this is from John, and these are people debating about whether Jesus healed or not. And you've actually gone over part of this passage. It was heard, or it was not heard from the ages, right? Ek, by the way, is a prepositional phrase that is modifying this verbal idea. It was not heard source from the ages. So really the source or origin, this is a spatial use for a temporal metaphor. So it's never been heard is the idea. It's never been heard, hoti, that someone born blind, someone having been born blind, having been born ophthalmos tuflu, eyes born, or eyes blind, or someone who has been born blind, their eyes being opening their eyes, right? So opening the eyes of someone born blind is the basic idea here. But with the main thing that you want to get figure out here is what is the subject of ekusthe? So we have an aorist passive indicative third person singular. And we normally translate this as it was not heard ever, right? It has never been heard, more idiomatically. That it is a place marker in English. We put that on the front to as a place marker for the subject, which is later described. But really, what the subject of the hearing is this hoti clause, that someone born blind's eyes have been opened. That is what has never been heard. So that's actually the subject of our main verb. That someone whose eyes have been born blind, that someone who has been born blind, their eyes have been opened, that reality has never been heard. That's the idea. So there, this hoti clause functions as a subject. Hoti clauses, however, can also function as indirect or as direct objects. So, for instance, in Revelation 2:4, I'll echo, but I have kata su against you. I have against you hoti. I have this, right? So if we're translating that and putting place markers in, I have this against you. And then what is that this? That your love, that you have forsaken your first love, right? And so this hoti clause, I have that you have forsaken your first love against you. I have this idea, I have the notion that you have forsaken your first love is something that I hold against you. So in the same way as that other hoti clause filled in the subject slot, here this hoti fills in the object slot. So both of these, in theory then, are functioning substantively, as substantives, as a subject or a direct object. And then finally, apposition. An apposition is not the main subject or the direct object, but it will state in another way subject or direct object. So we can look at this in John 3:19. But this is the judgment, right? But this is the judgment that the light has come into the world. Let's see, I'll use my pointer. The light has come into the world, and human beings loved rather darkness than the light. So the human beings love darkness more than the light. And that is the judgment that is come, right? That's the judgment against the world. This is the judgment. That is, namely, that the light has come into the world and human beings love darkness more than light. So what is the judgment? That specific thing. And that's an apposition then, because it is just giving the description of that judgment. And so it functions substantively. One that we're probably more familiar with that we see quite a bit is haughty as a marker of mental perception. What does that mean? It gives the substance of what the thought or the mental idea is. So we have this example from 1 John 2:3. And in this, let me get my pointer again. And in this we are knowing, and in this we know that we have known him, right? And that we have known him is the content of the knowing. And in this we know that we have known him. By the way, also the antecedent, or probably better to put it, subsequent is another way to put it. If we keep his commandments, we know, right? So this stands in for all of this. If we keep his commandments, we know, and then the content of the knowing, that we have known him. So haughty often will stand in as a marker of mental perception. And this really, what we're going to have here is marker of mental perception, marker of indirect discourse, and marker of direct discourse. Those three are actually are really different forms of the same thing. They're giving the content of thought or speech. Marker of indirect discourse, eon epomen. If we might say, haughty, that we have fellowship with him, and in the darkness we are walking, right? So if we say we have fellowship with him, but we're walking in the darkness, we lie. And we do not have the truth. So if we might say that we have fellowship with him, and that's a marker of indirect discourse. He's giving you indirectly what is being said. And here we can see that the logical relationship is also a conditional sentence, which is a future more probable. Aeon plus the subjunctive, and then pseudometha, then we are lying. And then marker of direct discourse. So as long as we know the difference between indirect discourse and direct discourse, that's pretty easy. And then knowing that mental perception is not discourse per se, but a mental discourse kind of, then we see that all of those notions relate together. But here we have the one saying that I have known him, and his commandments not keeping is a liar. So the one who is saying, quote, I have known him, that's a direct discourse. The one saying, I have known him, you'll notice with direct discourse, by the way, where indirect discourse, you want to translate the haughty as that. With direct discourse, you can drop that haughty. That haughty can totally drop out. Sometimes, now this is the second category, apexegetical. So we moved away from substantive, and now we're on apexegetical if you're following along on that handout. And apexegetical explains, clarifies, and completes. It's different than apposition, because apposition creates another substantive that can stand in for the previous substantive, that it's just stating it in a different way. Apexegetical is modifying and explaining the substantive, not replacing it. So therefore the Jews answered and said to him, what sign, or the Judeans, what sign are you going to show? Are you showing to us that you will do these things? That you will do these things is modifying sign. The idea here, what sign are you going to show to us, stands on its own. And that you will do these things doesn't replace the idea of sign. It further explains what kind of sign we're talking about. It's not just any sign, but specifically a sign that is designed to show that Jesus is doing these things. That's the idea. So apexegetical will explain a noun and not replace it, where apposition will replace it. And a haughty clause can mark both of those. It can mark off a specific clause that is designed to function in that way logically. And then our final use of haughty is one that you are very familiar with, and shouldn't be too hard for you to grasp. This is the causal haughty. This is the only one that we translate as because. Interestingly, I think that and you can take what I'm saying now with a grain of salt, but interestingly, logically, it's problematic to call it a causal hoti because the logical relationship that it produces is actually substantiation, so that the clauses that it relates, the first clause is substantiated. This claim that's made in the first clause is the reason for it is substantiated in the second clause. And honestly, if I had time, I would do more in terms of structural relationships and getting you to structurally analyze texts, as I think it's really important, especially from the perspective of knowing Greek and doing that. But we don't have time for that, and there's already enough in this class, so we won't do it. But it's really called causal because it uses the word because, not because of necessarily the logical relationship, which is in structural terms is the opposite. But don't let whatever I just said, don't let that confuse you. So let's look at John 2:11, 1 John 2:11. The one hating his brother or sister is in the darkness, right? Locative and indicating where they are, modifying that verb. And in the darkness is walking. Again, locative N, locative prepositional phrase, is walking in the darkness. And that one does not know, and this is translated as that one because it's obviously nomic. It's not male or female that we're talking about. We're not just talking about men. That one does not know where he or she is going because, right, here's our causal hoti. Why do they not know where they're going? Because the darkness has blinded that one's eyes. Really easy causal, so that shouldn't be too hard for you to get at. Now we move on to hina. So that's all the uses of the hoti. Now we move on to hina, and I'll just give you an example of different possibilities for understanding the hina. One of the most common ones, of course, is purpose. And you'll find that you might do that instinctively. So we see in 1 John 2:11, Teknia mu, my children, tauta grapho, I am writing these things, humin, to you. Why? What is the purpose of the writing? Hina, in order that you might not sin. In order that you might not sin. And of course, as I said with hina, usually you have the subjunctive. So that one's pretty straightforward, a purpose of hina. Our second one is related to purpose and is often coupled with purpose, but the logical idea here is not purpose. It's not the action that happens is not done for that specific reason, but it's just the result. It happens with the result that, so that. So, for instance, we look at Romans 11:11, and that's actually an important theological, exegetical distinction between purpose and result in this passage. Lego un, I am saying, therefore, and here's a question mark. Did they stumble in order that they might fall or fall away? So it's talking about Israel, and he mentions that Israel has stumbled, but he wants to not say that they have completely fallen away. Did they stumble in order they may fall away? Now, what we have here, by the way, when we begin a question mark with this particle at the beginning, the negative particle may, we are expecting a negative answer. No, of course not, to the question. If it begins with oo, it would be something like, didn't they stumble with the result that they're falling away? And rhetorically, that means, yeah, they did, didn't they? But that's not what Paul is saying. So Paul is not saying that. So that may is actually incredibly important exegetically. Know that that often happens with questions, where you'll have may that begins that question, and that means it expects a negative response, and if it begins with oo, it expects a positive response. So therefore, I am saying they didn't stumble in order that they might fall, did they? Me genoita, right? So we talked about that with Paul. This is the optative mood. No way, no way. A lot of New Testament professors and Greek professors will, in order to get the point home or just maybe to sound cool, will offer lots of swear words in relation to this. And I'm not going to sink to that level, but this is Paul saying, heck no or hell no, right? That's the idea. But what we have here, the hina, is not purposive, right? They didn't fall for the purpose of falling. They didn't stumble for the purpose of falling, right, or falling away. They stumbled. They didn't. The idea is that they stumble with the result of falling away, and that's still no. They didn't do that. But the idea there is result, not purpose. Wallace also wants to give this category of purpose and result, and I think that is legitimate, especially considering the relationship between purpose and result. While we might want to put all of the examples of purpose or result into neat categories where they're definitely purpose only or they're definitely result only, I think we've learned that language is not that simple, and there's a lot of complexity to it. So, for instance, here in this third category, let's look at John 3:16, which is a perfect example. For thusly God loved the world, so that the Son, his only Son, he gave. Edoken, he gave his only Son. What's interesting too, by the way, this result clause with hosta indicates often a result that might be unexpected. So the extent of the giving might be even expressed there, but that's a little bit speculative. I'm just throwing it out there, and that's more of a classical idea. But it is interesting that he uses that John uses hosta there. So God so loved the world so that he gave his only Son. Why? In order that, so for the purpose that each one who believes in him might not perish but have eternal life. But also, he gave him with the result that each one who believes in him might not perish but have eternal life. The purpose and result there notion is not clearly defined, and it seems that we have both, and I think that's okay. And so in John 3:16, and so does Wallace in his categories. Hina also is not immune to the substantival interpretation, and so everything we saw with the hoti happens with the Hina as well. So Hina clauses can create subjects. Here in Matthew 18:6, hos da'an scandalise, so whoever might scandalize, cheneton mikron tuton, one of the least of these, of those believing in me. So whoever might scandal one of the least of these believing in me, it is better. Now here, remember that it? That sure sounds like a placeholder bit, it. So let's look at that. Blank is better. And the idea is blank is better than scandalizing the least of these, right? Blank is better than scandalizing the least of these. Well, where does that blank filled in? It is better for her or him, right? Her or him. It is better for her or him. Hina, in order that he might attach a millstone around his neck, right, and then be thrown into a pit, right? It is better for him. What is better? That he or she attaches a millstone around his neck is better for her or him than scandalizing one of the least of these. So again, this is a little bit convoluted and it takes some thinking and parsing to get at, but it does. Hina clauses can function as subjects of verbs. They can also function, as did the hotis, as direct objects. So hoti estin, that this is the promise, or because this is the promise, but since we know that we're not going to be, well, I guess we could do it as because this is the promise which you heard from the beginning. Hina, agapomen allelus, that you love one another, right? This actually stands in for the promise, right? So this is the promise which you heard from the beginning, that you love one another. So it stands in for that promise. Apexegetical. What I mean is a good way to do it. For I, and this is the centurion that's coming to Jesus in Luke. For I am not worthy. And then it has a hina clause that is explaining, it's modifying the adjective, right? Or what here is the predicate adjective. What kind of not worthy? I am not worthy that under my roof, that you might come under my roof. And so that hina clause is apexegetically modifying hikanos. So it's functioning really adjectivally. And it's important to be able to distinguish between it functioning adjectively and it functioning substantively. And all of those are really substantive uses, and that's dramatically different than purpose or result or purpose result, because those are adverbial ways of understanding hina, or ways of hina functioning. It can also function complementary. That means it completes the idea of the main verb, kaikathos, and just as theleta, you desire, and then it gives the content of the desire. So it completes the desire. Desire what? And where infinitive would be you desire to do something, right? And that would be the complementary infinitive. Here it's a complementary hina. You desire that they might do that, whatever men might do to you, you should do likewise, is the idea here. And then finally, imperatival uses only the poor that we might remember, right? So this is actually a little bit convoluted and abbreviated phrase, but this is Paul reporting back to the Galatians about the Jerusalem Council and how the Jerusalem Council didn't add any new teaching to them. They just wanted them to remember the poor. So it's kind of an imperatival idea, only of the poor that we remember them. It's an imperative that they remember them. This is a rare idea, and you won't encounter it too often. So all of this really is just to give a little bit of insight into these ideas that are inherent in the hina, in the hoti, and that are available for you on this reference sheet. So a lot of this I want you to be able to recognize and talk about and maybe answer multiple choice questions about. But really what I want you to do is to be able to recognize them in your translations, in your exegetical work. Because what we're focused on right now, we've been focusing on words and interclausal relationships and things like that. But now what's going on is that I want you to think about the logic of larger passages. And we've been doing a lot of translation, so that should help you. So a lot of this is going to be reference material for you in that.